The lobby of Monarch Financial Bank gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The marble floors reflected the cold brass fixtures, polished desks, and the hurried movements of employees. Zara Adebayo stood at the counter, her posture steady, her expression calm but purposeful. She wore a simple cardigan and slacks, unassuming yet quietly commanding. The teller glanced at her briefly before looking away, her smile faltering. "Next in line," she called out, her voice slightly strained. Zara stepped forward, placing a neatly bound folder on the counter. "I'd like to discuss loan approval discrepancies for minority applicants," she said evenly, her tone polite, but firm. The teller froze for a moment before forcing a smile. "Let me get my manager." A few murmurs rippled through the lobby as Zara waited. Customers exchanged glances, whispering softly to one another. Ethan Caldwell appeared moments later, his tailored suit immaculate and his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he approached the counter. His expression was neutral, but his eyes carried a hint of suspicion as they swept over Zara. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice laced with faux politeness. "Yes," Zara replied calmly, meeting his gaze directly. "Your loan approval. Rates for black applicants are 40% lower than others." "Why?" Ethan's smirk faltered for a split second before he regained composure. "Our process is fair," he said curtly, crossing his arms. Zara didn't blink. "Fair? Then why are minority applications flagged disproportionately?" A customer nearby whispered to another, "Who does she think she is?" Ethan's lips tightened as he leaned closer to Zara across the counter. The tension in the room thickened, the marble floors seeming colder than ever. Ethan Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his polished demeanor cracking as his tone sharpened. "We don't tolerate fraud here," he said, his words slicing through the air like a blade. Zara Adebayo didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her voice calm and deliberate. "Fraud?" "Yes," Ethan replied, his smirk returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Fabricating data to slander this institution." Zara raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The silence between them grew heavy, drawing the attention of nearby customers and employees. Ethan gestured sharply to the security guard stationed near the entrance. "Escort her out," he ordered. The guards approached Zara, their movements brisk and rehearsed. One of them reached for her arm, but Zara stepped back slightly, raising her hands in a gesture of calm compliance. "I'd like to speak to your regional director," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a quiet storm. Ethan chuckled darkly and shook his head. "You'll speak to the police first," he said smugly. The guards exchanged glances before pulling out handcuffs. The metallic clink echoed through the pristine lobby, drawing gasps from onlookers. "What's going on?" a woman whispered to her companion. "She doesn't look like a criminal," another murmured hesitantly, pulling out their phone to record the scene. Zara extended her wrists calmly as the guards restrained her, her posture dignified despite the humiliation unfolding around her. "This is a mistake," she said softly, her voice steady but firm. Ethan crossed his arms and smirked again, watching as Zara was escorted toward the exit. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. The metallic sound of the handcuffs locking around Zara Adebayo's wrists echoed through the lobby, louder than the murmurs of customers and employees. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Zara remained poised, her shoulders squared and her chin held high. "What's happening?" a woman whispered to her companion, clutching her purse tightly. "She must have done something," the man beside her replied, though his tone carried more doubt than certainty. The security guards flanked Zara, guiding her toward the exit with practiced precision. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. She didn't resist, didn't argue. Her silence spoke louder than any protest could have. Ethan Caldwell stood near the counter, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a smug expression. His confidence radiated as he glanced at the stunned faces in the room. But then Zara's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the stillness. The guard nearest to her hesitated before reaching for it. "Leave it," Zara said firmly, her voice cutting through the moment like a blade. The guard froze, glancing at Ethan for direction. Ethan's smirk faltered slightly as his eyes caught sight of the phone's screen lighting up. Monarch Financial Board. His face paled for a brief second before he quickly masked it with indifference. He turned away from Zara and busied himself with a stack of papers on the counter, but his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled them aimlessly. Zara glanced over her shoulder as she was led toward the glass doors. Her gaze met Ethan's briefly, calm, piercing, and unyielding. For a moment, Ethan felt an unfamiliar pang of doubt ripple through him. Outside, a bystander recorded the scene on their phone, whispering to another. "She doesn't look scared." Ethan Caldwell stood behind the counter, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. His smirk lingered, but it was starting to crack. He watched as Zara Adebayo was escorted toward the patrol car waiting outside, her calm demeanor unnerving, him in ways he couldn't explain. The buzz of her phone still echoed in his mind. Monarch Financial Board. The name alone sent a ripple of unease through him. A reporter's voice carried through the lobby, sharp and deliberate. "This is Lena Park, live at Monarch Financial Bank, where a woman has just been arrested under questionable circumstances." Ethan turned toward the window, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the reporter standing just outside the building, her camera crew capturing every moment. Zara stepped into the patrol car with quiet composure, her head held high despite the flashing lights and murmurs surrounding her. Ethan's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out hastily and glanced at the screen. Missed calls from the board flooded his notifications. His fingers hovered over the call button, but he didn't press it. Inside the patrol car, Zara answered her own phone, her voice steady as she spoke. "Yes, this is Zara Adebayo. Thank you for confirming. I'll see you at the emergency meeting shortly." Ethan's breath caught as he watched her through the glass. The weight of her words hit him like a freight train. "Emergency meeting?" His smirk faltered completely now, replaced by an expression of unease that he couldn't hide. He turned away from the window abruptly, gripping the edge of the counter as if trying to steady himself. The sound of murmurs and camera shutters filled the air behind him, but Ethan felt suddenly very alone. The patrol car pulled away slowly, its taillights glowing faintly in the evening haze. Zara Adebayo sat in the back seat, her posture upright, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She held her phone loosely in her hand, her thumb hovering over the screen as she considered her next call. Inside Monarch Financial Bank, Ethan Caldwell stood frozen near the counter, staring out at the street through the large glass windows. His reflection stared back at him. A man whose confidence had begun to crumble. A junior employee approached hesitantly, holding a phone receiver in her hand. "Sir," she said softly, "the board is on line 1. Ethan's head turned sharply toward her, his eyes wide with panic. He took the receiver from her hand without a word and pressed it to his ear. "This is Caldwell," he said quickly, his voice strained. The voice on the other end was curt and cold. "We need you at headquarters. Now!" Ethan swallowed hard, glancing around the lobby as murmurs grew louder. Customers whispered to one another, their gazes flickering between him and the door Zara had just exited through. Outside, Zara's car stopped briefly at a red light. She answered another call, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, I'll be there. Shortly. Thank you for waiting." The light turned green and the car disappeared down the street. Ethan watched it go, his grip tightening around the receiver until his knuckles turned white. He placed it back on its base with trembling hands and turned to face the lobby once more. A bystander near the door whispered to another, "Did you see her face? She wasn't scared." Ethan's jaw tightened as he walked briskly toward his office, his footsteps echoing loudly against the marble floors. Ethan Caldwell sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen casting shadows over his face. His LinkedIn profile was open, the cursor blinking in the Connections tab. The page was stagnant. No new requests, no messages, no activity. He refreshed the page again, his movements mechanical, hoping for something that wouldn't come. The same empty notifications stared back at him. A faint knock sounded at the door. Ethan turned his head slightly but didn't respond. The knock came again, louder this time. "Mr. Caldwell?" A junior employee called softly from outside. Ethan cleared his throat and straightened his posture. "What is it?" The door opened hesitantly, and the employee stepped in, holding a stack of papers. "These are the applications flagged for review," she said, placing them on his desk. Ethan glanced at the papers briefly before turning back to his screen. "Leave them," he muttered, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. The employee hesitated for a moment before stepping out quietly, closing the door behind her. Ethan stared at the stack of papers, his mind drifting to Zara Adebayo's calm voice during the arrest. "Your loan approval rates for black applicants are 40% lower than others." The words echoed in his head like a haunting refrain. He minimized the LinkedIn tab and opened his email inbox instead. Rejection emails filled the screen. "Thank you for applying, but we've chosen another candidate. We regret to inform you that your application has been declined." Ethan scrolled through them slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. His hands trembled as he clicked on yet another rejection email before slamming the laptop shut. Abruptly, the room fell silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Ethan Caldwell sat slouched in his chair, his laptop open in front of him. The screen glowed faintly, illuminating his tired face. His inbox was filled with rejection emails, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen. He clicked on the latest email, his jaw tightening as he read the familiar words. "Thank you for applying, but we've chosen another candidate." His down hand hovered over the mouse for a moment before he clicked on another email. The subject line read, "Application Status Update." He opened it quickly, hoping for something different this time. "We regret to inform you." Ethan let out a frustrated sigh and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His phone buzzed on the desk beside him, but he didn't pick it up. He already knew what it would say. Another notification from LinkedIn, reminding him to update his profile or connect with colleagues who weren't responding to his messages. Silence in the room was suffocating. Ethan glanced at the stack of papers on his desk, the flagged loan applications that had been left there earlier. He reached for them hesitantly and flipped through the pages. Each file told a story. Denied loans, rejected applications, flagged risks, all tied to minority applicants. Ethan's chest tightened as he realized how many of these decisions had passed through his hands over the years. A memory flashed in his mind, Zara Adebayo standing at the counter, her voice calm but piercing. "Why are minority applications flagged disproportionately?" Ethan slammed the papers down on the desk and pushed them away as if trying to distance himself from the weight of what they represented. He stared at the wall in front of him, his mind racing but unable to escape the silence. Ethan Caldwell walked into the co-working space, his shoulders slumped and his briefcase hanging loosely at his side. The room buzzed quietly with the sound of keyboards clicking and muted conversations. He scanned the space, searching for a familiar face, but none looked up to greet him. He approached an empty desk near the corner, placing his briefcase down with a heavy thud. A group of professionals sat nearby, laughing softly as they exchanged ideas. Ethan's gaze lingered on them for a moment before he opened his laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying his LinkedIn profile once again. The Connections tab was still empty, the inbox devoid of responses. He refreshed the page out of habit, but nothing changed. A young man at the adjacent desk glanced at Ethan briefly before turning back to his work, his expression indifferent. Ethan cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward him. "Excuse me?" he began hesitantly. "Do you know if this space hosts networking sessions?" The man looked up, his brows furrowing slightly. "Not sure," he replied curtly before returning to his screen without another word. Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the interaction settle heavily on him. He opened his email inbox and scrolled through the rejection letters. "Once more, we appreciate your interest but have decided to move forward with other candidates. Unfortunately, your qualifications do not align with our current needs." His hand trembled as he closed the laptop abruptly, the sound echoing in the quiet corner of the room. He glanced around again, hoping for someone to acknowledge him, but no one did. The room seemed colder now, the hum of activity fading into a silence that felt suffocating. The conference room at Monarch Financial's headquarters was alive with energy. Employees, community leaders, and journalists filled the space, their eyes fixed on Zara Adebayo as she stood at the podium. Her tailored suit was sharp, but it was her calm confidence that truly commanded the room. She adjusted the microphone slightly, her movements deliberate. "Today," she began, her voice steady but filled with conviction, "we're taking the first step toward righting decades of wrongs." The room fell silent, every person leaning in closer to hear her next words. Zara held up a folder marked Minority Loan Initiative, its bold title visible to the crowd. This program is designed to support minority entrepreneurs, those who have been systematically denied access to opportunities they deserve. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Cameras flashed as reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Zara continued, her tone unwavering. "For too long, risk management has been used as an excuse to perpetuate inequality. That ends here." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound filling the room like a wave. Zara stepped back from the podium, briefly, letting the moment settle before speaking again. "This isn't just about loans. It's about rebuilding trust and creating pathways for success." In the front row, a community leader nodded approvingly. "This is what we've been waiting for," he whispered to his colleague. Zara glanced across the room, her gaze landing on a young black woman seated near the back. The woman's eyes glistened with hope as she clapped enthusiastically. Zara smiled faintly before stepping away from the podium. The camera lingered on Zara as she shook hands with attendees, her presence radiating quiet strength and determination. The lobby of Monarch Financial Bank had been completely transformed. Gone were the cold brass fixtures and sterile walls. In their place hung framed photographs of faces, black families, small business owners, and community leaders who had once been denied the opportunities they deserved. At the center of the lobby stood a large plaque, its inscription bold yet simple, honoring those who deserved better. Beneath it was a black and white photo of an elderly woman, her face lined with wisdom and quiet strength, Zara Adebayo's grandmother. Zara stood near the entrance, watching as customers entered the space. Some paused to read the plaque, their expressions softening as they took in the stories behind the images. Others walked slowly along the walls, their fingers brushing lightly against the frames as if connecting with the past. A young man in a suit approached Zara hesitantly. "This is different," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "It's necessary," Zara replied simply, her gaze steady. In one corner of the lobby, a mother crouched beside her daughter, pointing to one of the photos. "That's your great-uncle," she said softly. "He tried to open a shop here once." The little girl looked up at her mother, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Did he?" Her mother shook her head gently. "No, but now others can." Zara overheard the exchange and smiled faintly, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She turned toward a group of employees gathered near the counter. "This isn't just a redesign," she said firmly. "It's a reminder of where we've been and where we're going." The employees nodded solemnly, their eyes reflecting both respect and determination. The camera panned across the lobby one last time, capturing its warmth and newfound purpose. The lobby hummed softly with quiet, conversations, and the occasional shuffle of papers. Zara Adebayo stood near the counter, speaking with a group of employees. Her presence was calm, yet commanding, her words deliberate as she outlined the next steps for the bank's transformation. From across the room, a young black girl watched her intently. She stood beside her mother, clutching a small backpack and shifting nervously on her feet. Her wide eyes darted between the photographs on the walls and Zara's poised figure. "Go on," her mother whispered, nudging her gently forward. The girl hesitated before taking a few tentative steps toward Zara. She stopped just short of interrupting the conversation, her small voice barely audible as she spoke. "Excuse me, Ms. Adebayo?" Zara turned, her expression softening as she crouched slightly to meet the girl's gaze. "Yes?" she said warmly. The girl fidgeted with the straps of her backpack before blurting out, "Can I work here someday?" The room seemed to pause. For a moment, the quiet weight of her question settling over everyone nearby. Zara's smile widened slightly as she studied the girl's hopeful face. "You can do anything you set your mind to," Zara replied gently. "And if you want to work here one day, I'll make sure there's a place for you." The girl beamed, her nervousness melting away as she looked back at her mother, who nodded with quiet pride. Zara straightened and placed a hand lightly on the girl's shoulder. "What's your name?" "Amara," the girl said shyly. "Well, Amara," Zara said with a smile, "I'll be looking out for you." The camera lingered on Amara's bright expression before panning back to Zara, whose steady gaze reflected both hope and determination. Ethan Caldwell sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. The room was sparse, stripped of the polished decor and expensive furniture that had once defined his life. On the coffee table in front of him sat a single framed photograph, its edges worn from years of handling. He picked it up slowly, his fingers brushing against the glass. The photo showed him shaking hands with a smiling client outside Monarch Financial Bank. His suit was sharp, his smile confident, and his posture radiated authority. It was a version of himself that felt like a distant memory now. Ethan's eyes lingered on the image, but instead of pride, he felt a deep pang of regret. He placed the photo back on the table and flipped it face down, unable to look at it any longer. His laptop sat open on the couch beside him, its screen glowing faintly. He glanced at it reluctantly before reaching over and tapping the touchpad. His email inbox appeared, filled with rejection letters. "We regret to inform you." "Thank you for your interest, but—" Ethan exhaled shakily and closed the laptop with a soft click. He leaned back against the couch, his gaze drifting to the ceiling as memories of Zara Adebayo flooded his mind, her calm voice during their confrontation, her unshaken composure as she was led out of the bank. Her words echoed in his head. "Why are minority applications flagged disproportionately?" Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to push the thought away, but it clung to him like a shadow he couldn't escape. He glanced at the flipped photograph one last time before standing and walking toward the window. Outside, the city moved on without him. The streets outside Monarch Financial Bank were quiet, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Zara Adebayo stepped out of the building, her stride steady and purposeful. The evening air was cool, carrying with it a sense of calm that contrasted sharply with the tension that had filled the bank earlier. Inside, employees gathered near the counter, exchanging quiet words about Zara's leadership. "She's changing everything," one whispered. Another nodded, their expression thoughtful. Ethan Caldwell lingered across the street, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He stood in the shadows, watching Zara through the glass windows as she greeted customers and employees alike. Her smile was warm, her presence commanding without being overbearing. Ethan took a step forward but stopped abruptly, his breath hitching as he realized he couldn't bring himself to cross the street. The weight of everything, the rejection, letters, the empty desk, Zara's calm yet piercing words, held him back like an invisible wall. Zara turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room before landing briefly on the windows. For a fleeting moment, her eyes seemed to meet Ethan's through the glass. She didn't react, didn't acknowledge him, but her steady gaze carried an unspoken message. "This is no longer your space." Ethan stepped back into the shadows, his shoulders slumping as he turned away from the bank. His footsteps echoed softly against the pavement as he walked down the street, his head bowed and his hands trembling slightly in his pockets. Behind him, Monarch Financial gleamed brightly, its new plaque visible even from a distance, honoring those who deserved better. Ethan glanced back once but quickly turned away, disappearing into the night. The community hall was packed, the hum of quiet conversations filling the air as people from all walks of life gathered to hear Zara Adebayo speak. The stage was modest, but Zara's presence made it feel grand. She stood at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edges, her expression calm but resolute. She scanned the room briefly, taking in the faces of those who had come. Young, entrepreneurs, community leaders, families who had once been denied opportunities. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of hope and anticipation. Zara leaned into the microphone, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," she began, her words cutting through the murmurs. "It's about building something better." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. "For decades," she continued, "systems like this one have thrived on exclusion, on deciding who gets to succeed and who doesn't. But today, we're rewriting that story." A man in the front row nodded slowly, his arms crossed as he listened intently. A young woman near the back wiped a tear from her cheek. Zara paused for a moment, letting her words settle before continuing. "This isn't about me. It's about all of us, about creating a future where success isn't determined by your last name or the color of your skin." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound filling the hall like a wave. Zara stepped back slightly, allowing the moment to breathe before speaking again. "This is just the beginning," she said softly but firmly, her voice carrying over the applause. "And together, we'll make sure it lasts." The camera lingered on Zara as she stepped away from the podium, her expression one of quiet determination. The morning sun bathed the exterior of Monarch Financial Bank in golden light, its new sign gleaming proudly above the entrance. Inside, the lobby buzzed with quiet activity as employees greeted customers and carried out their work with a renewed sense of purpose. Zara Adebayo stood near the entrance, her gaze steady as she watched the flow of people coming and going. The plaque, honoring past, denied applicants, caught her eye, and she walked toward it slowly. Her fingers brushed lightly against the engraved words, "Honoring those who deserved better." She turned to see a young black entrepreneur shaking hands with one of the bank's loan officers. The sight brought a faint smile to her lips, a small but significant victory in a much larger battle. Outside, a reporter stood with a camera crew, capturing footage of the bank's transformation. "This marks a new chapter for Monarch Financial," the reporter said into the microphone. "A chapter defined by accountability, equity, and hope." Zara stepped outside, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The reporter turned toward her, microphone extended. "Ms. Adebayo," she asked, "what's next for you?" Zara paused, her expression thoughtful as she looked directly into the camera. "This isn't about what's next for me," she said calmly. "It's about what's next for all of us." The camera zoomed in on her face as she continued. "This is just the beginning." The crew lowered their equipment as Zara walked away, her silhouette framed by the morning light. The camera lingered on the bank's new sign before fading to black, leaving only Zara's final words echoing softly. "Just the beginning." The kitchen was quiet, the faint ticking of the wall clock the only sound breaking the stillness. Zara Adebayo sat at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the letter in front of her. The paper was worn at the edges, its creases deep from being handled too many times. Her eyes scanned the words she already knew by heart. "We regret to inform you that your loan application has been denied." She exhaled slowly, pressing her lips together as tears stung her eyes. The rejection wasn't new. She had faced it before, in different forms, from different places. But this one felt heavier, sharper, as if it carried the weight of generations. Her gaze drifted to a photo on the counter, a black and white image of her grandmother, standing proudly in front of a small shop she had dreamed of opening in the 1960s. Zara closed her eyes, and the flashback came unbidden. Her grandmother sat at a similar table decades ago, holding a rejection letter from Monarch Financial Bank. The words were different, but the meaning was the same. We cannot approve your loan at this time. Her face was etched with quiet rage as she folded the letter and placed it beside a stack of unpaid bills. Zara opened her eyes and looked down at her own letter again. The parallels were undeniable, and they burned in her chest like fire. She reached for her notebook and began scribbling furiously, notes about discrepancies in loan approval rates, patterns she had noticed over months of research. Her phone buzzed beside her, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Grace Mbeki, her mentor. Zara picked up and said quietly, "It happened again." Grace's voice was sharp on the other end. "Then it's time to stop letting it happen." Zara nodded to herself, resolve hardening in her chest as she stared at the rejection letter one last time before crumpling it in her hand. Zara sat across from Grace Mbeki in her mentor's modest but cluttered office. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, the walls lined with shelves filled with binders and reports. Grace, a seasoned civil rights advocate, leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes scanning the file Zara had handed her. "This isn't new," Grace said finally, her voice low but cutting. She tossed the folder onto the desk, where it landed with a dull thud. "This system wasn't built for us." Zara sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She had heard Grace say this before, but today it felt different, more urgent. Grace leaned forward suddenly, slamming another file onto the desk. "Look at this," she said, flipping it open to reveal photos of redlined neighborhoods. Entire communities denied loans and opportunities because of the color of their skin. This is what they've been doing for decades. Different words, same outcome. Zara's jaw tightened as she stared at the images. "It's not just neighborhoods anymore," she said softly. "It's individuals, families trying to start, businesses, students trying to pay for school." Grace nodded grimly. "And they call it risk management." Her tone dripped with disdain as she emphasized the phrase. Zara reached for one of the photos, her fingers brushing against the faded ink lines that marked entire areas as undesirable. Her grandmother's face flashed in her mind again, proud but defeated as she folded her rejection letter all those years ago. "I can't keep watching this happen," Zara said finally, her voice steady but filled with quiet determination. Grace studied her for a moment before leaning back in her chair again. "Then don't," she said simply. "Rebuild it." Zara met Grace's gaze, and something shifted inside her, a spark igniting into a flame. She nodded slowly, her resolve hardening with each passing second. "I will," she whispered. The camera lingered on Zara's face as she picked up the file and stood ready to take the first step toward dismantling what had stood unchallenged for far too long. The conference room was silent except for the faint rustle of papers. Zara Adebayo sat at the head of the long table, her posture composed but her mind racing. In front of her lay the final document that would make her the majority shareholder of Monarch Financial Bank. The pen in her hand felt heavier than it should have, its weight symbolic of the change she was about to set in motion. She signed her name with deliberate strokes, each letter etched with purpose. The lawyer seated beside her nodded and slid the papers into a folder. "Congratulations, Ms. Adebayo," he said formally. "You now own controlling interest in Monarch Financial." Zara didn't respond immediately. She stared at the folder for a moment, her mind flashing back to the rejection letter that had brought her here, the same letter that had brought her grandmother to tears decades ago. Later that afternoon, Zara entered Monarch Financial's flagship branch dressed in a thrifted coat and plain scarf, blending in as just another customer. Her calm demeanor masked the storm brewing inside her as she approached the counter. "I'd like to apply for a loan," she said evenly, sliding a completed application across the desk. The loan officer barely glanced at it before setting it aside. "We'll review this and get back to you," he said dismissively, already turning his attention to another customer, a white man whose application was approved within minutes. Zara stepped back quietly, pulling out her phone and discreetly recording the interaction. Her pen moved swiftly across a small notebook as she documented every detail: the officer's tone, the time taken with each applicant, the discrepancies in treatment. She wandered through the lobby, observing how minority applicants were subtly redirected or dismissed entirely while others were welcomed with smiles and efficiency. Her calm exterior never wavered, but inside, she felt the fire burning brighter. This wasn't just an observation, it was evidence. Evidence of a system that had thrived on exclusion for too long. The hum of the office was steady, punctuated by the soft clicking of keyboards and the occasional ring of a phone. Zara Adebayo sat in the waiting area, her thrifted coat draped neatly over her lap as she observed the flow of activity around her. Her notebook rested on her knee, pen poised to capture every detail. Across the room, a loan officer flipped through a stack of applications, his movements brisk and indifferent. He paused at one file, a black man's application, and scribbled "high risk" in bold red ink across the top without reading further. Zara's grip on her pen tightened as she watched, her gaze steady but piercing. She glanced at her phone, discreetly recording the moment from her lap. Moments later, another file landed on the desk, a white applicant's paperwork. The officer scanned it briefly, before nodding approvingly and placing it in the approved pile. The entire interaction lasted less than 2 minutes. Zara leaned back slightly, her calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside her. She scribbled, a note in her notebook: disparity in review times, minority applications flagged without basis. A young black woman approached the counter hesitantly, clutching a folder to her chest. The loan officer barely glanced at her before saying, "We'll call you once we've reviewed your application." His tone was clipped, dismissive. The woman nodded quietly and stepped away, her shoulders slumped as she walked toward the exit. Zara's eyes followed her, noting every detail: the hesitation in her steps, the disappointment etched on her face. Nearby, a white man laughed with another officer as his loan approval was finalized with a handshake. Zara turned back to the desk where the high-risk file still sat untouched. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, a reminder of the growing evidence she was compiling. She glanced down at it briefly, before returning her focus to the scene, unfolding around her. This wasn't just bias, it was systemic exclusion laid bare. The conference room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension as Zara Adebayo sat at the head of the table. Her legal team surrounded her, their expressions grim as they sifted through stacks of documents. The faint sound of papers rustling filled the silence, punctuated only by the occasional sigh of disbelief. One of the lawyers, a middle-aged man, with sharp eyes, pulled out a memo stamped "Confidential." He scanned it quickly before sliding it across the table to Zara. "You need to see this," he said quietly. Zara picked up the document, her hands steady despite the weight of what she was about to read. The memo was titled "Risk Management Guidelines," its language cold and clinical. Her eyes moved down the page, stopping at a line that made her stomach turn. "Limit high-value loans to non-minority clients to minimize risk exposure." The room fell silent as Zara's grip on the paper tightened. She read the words again, slower this time, as if trying to process their full impact. "This isn't risk management," she said finally, her voice low but sharp. "It's racism." One of the younger lawyers nodded solemnly, his face pale as he flipped through another file. "There's more," he said hesitantly, pulling out additional memos with similar directives. Coded language designed to exclude minority applicants while protecting wealthier white clients. Zara leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the stack of evidence piling up before her. Memories flooded her mind. Her grandmother's rejection letter, the loan officer scribbling "high risk" in red ink, the black woman dismissed at the counter without a second glance. She placed the memo down carefully and looked around the room. "This isn't just about one bank," she said firmly. "It's about an entire system that's been built to keep us out." Her team exchanged glances, their resolve hardening as they prepared for what was to come. Zara exhaled deeply and stood, clutching the memo tightly in her hand. Let's make sure they can't hide this anymore. Zara Adebayo sat alone at her kitchen table, the glow of her phone illuminating her face in the darkened room. The video of her arrest played on the screen, the sound muted, but the images speaking volumes. She watched herself standing calmly as the guards placed handcuffs around her wrists. The camera zoomed in on her face, composed, dignified, unshaken. The caption beneath the video read, "Black woman arrested for questioning loan discrimination." It had already been shared thousands of times, and the comments were flooding in faster than she could read them. This happened to my dad when he tried to get a loan for his business. They did this to me last week. Same bank. How? Many more stories like this are out there? Zara scrolled silently, her reflection in the screen a mix of grief and determination. The hashtags were trending globally. Banking while black, systemic racism exposed, justice for Zara. Her phone buzzed with notifications, texts from friends, emails from reporters, calls from activists wanting to amplify her story. But Zara ignored them all for now. She leaned back in her chair, her mind replaying the moment Ethan Caldwell had smirked at her across the counter, his arrogance so deeply rooted it felt immovable. But now, that same arrogance was unraveling under the weight of public scrutiny. The video had ignited something, a collective outrage that couldn't be silenced. Zara's gaze shifted to a notebook on the table beside her phone. She opened it and began writing furiously, jotting down ideas for next steps. Press conferences, public statements, partnerships with advocacy groups. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced by a system designed to exclude them. She paused for a moment, staring at the words she had written before, whispering to herself, "This is only the beginning." The camera lingered on Zara's determined expression as she picked up her phone and began dialing. Lena Park sat in the archives room of Monarch Financial's headquarters, her laptop open beside a stack of faded ledgers. The air was stale, heavy, with dust and the weight of secrets buried in the pages before her. She flipped through the old books carefully, her fingers brushing against handwritten notes and stamped approvals that told a story far different from the bank's public image. Her eyes narrowed as she came across a ledger marked 1965. She scanned the columns, loan applications, approvals, denials, until she reached a section labeled redlined areas. Entire neighborhoods were marked with bold red ink, their names scrawled beside the words, "Do not lend." Lena leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply. "They redlined entire neighborhoods here," she muttered to herself, her voice tinged with disbelief. She grabbed her phone and snapped a photo of the page, knowing this was evidence that couldn't be ignored. She continued flipping through the ledger, finding more directives hidden in the margins. High-risk applicants. Deny immediately. Prioritize. Loans for preferred clients. The coded language was clear. It wasn't about risk, it was about exclusion. Lena reached for another folder on the desk and opened it to find internal memos from the same time period. One memo read, "Focus lending efforts on areas with growth potential. Avoid demographics that may reduce profitability." She shook her head slowly, her fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. "The past and present are colliding," she whispered under her breath. Her phone buzzed beside her, a text from Zara Adebayo. "Any updates?" Lena replied quickly. "You won't believe what I've found." The camera zoomed in on Lena's determined expression as she packed up the documents and headed out of the archives room. The weight of history was heavy in her hands, but she knew it was time to bring it into the light. The cafe was dimly lit, its quiet hum of conversation muffled by the sound of clinking cups and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. Lena Park sat at a corner table, her notepad open and pen poised. Across from her sat Michael Harrington, a former employee of Monarch Financial. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his coffee cup, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Thank you for meeting me," Lena began softly, trying to ease his visible discomfort. Michael nodded but didn't look up. I don't know how much help I can be, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. You were there, Lena pressed gently. You saw how things worked from the inside. Michael exhaled shakily, his fingers tightening around the cup. We called it risk management, he said finally, his words slow and deliberate. But we all knew what it really meant. Lena leaned forward slightly, her pen hovering over the page. What did it mean? Michael's voice cracked as he replied, It meant denying loans to people who didn't fit their preferred profile. It meant redlining neighborhoods and flagging minority applicants as high risk without even reading their files. He paused, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his words was too much to bear. And you stayed silent? Lena asked, her tone careful but firm. Michael's head dropped further, shame etched into every line of his face. I stayed silent because I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid of losing my job, my reputation, everything. He looked up at Lena for the first time, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. But I'm sorry, I should have spoken up. Lena placed her pen down and met his gaze with quiet intensity. It's not too late, she said firmly. Michael nodded, hesitantly, his hands trembling as he reached into his bag and pulled out a folder filled with documents. This is everything I kept, he whispered. I hope it helps. The camera lingered on Lena's determined expression as she took the folder, knowing this confession could change everything. The newsroom buzzed with activity as reporters scrambled to piece together the story unfolding around Monarch Financial. Lena Park sat at her desk, her laptop open and multiple tabs filled with research on Ethan Caldwell. His name had surfaced repeatedly in connection with discriminatory practices at the bank, but now the deeper truths were starting to emerge. Lena clicked on an archived email thread between Ethan and senior executives. The subject line read, Diversity Training Feedback. She scanned the messages, her jaw tightening as she read Ethan's response. This is a waste of time. We hire based on merit, not quotas. She opened another file, a list of promotions within the bank over the past decade. Ethan's name appeared frequently, approving promotions for less qualified white employees over minority candidates with stronger credentials. Her phone buzzed beside her, a tip from an anonymous source. The message read, Check his comments. During team meetings, he mocked DEI initiatives openly. Lena leaned back in her chair, exhaling sharply as she processed the growing pile of evidence against him. She clicked on a video link sent by another source. The footage showed Ethan speaking at a staff meeting years ago. We don't need to change what works. If they don't like it, they can go somewhere else. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan's wife sat in their living room, scrolling through articles that detailed his involvement in Monarch Financial's discriminatory practices. Her face grew pale as she read headlines like, Bank Manager Linked to Systemic Bias, and Emails Reveal Mockery of Diversity Efforts. She stood abruptly and began packing a suitcase, her movements brisk and deliberate. Ethan entered the room, his expression tense as he noticed her actions. What are you doing? He asked sharply. She didn't look at him as she zipped the suitcase shut. I can't be part of this, she said quietly before walking out the door without another word. The camera lingered on Ethan's stunned expression as he stood alone in the empty room. Ethan Caldwell stepped into the office, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. The bullpen was unusually quiet, the usual chatter replaced by hushed whispers and stolen glances. Ethan scanned the room, his confidence faltering slightly as he noticed the way employees avoided his gaze. He walked toward his office expecting to find the familiar space that had been his domain for years. But when he reached the door, he froze. The nameplate that once proudly displayed Ethan Caldwell, Regional Manager, was gone. Inside, the desk was cleared out. No files, no personal items, nothing to suggest it had ever belonged to him. A junior clerk stood awkwardly near the doorway, clutching a cardboard box in her hands. Mr. Caldwell, she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. HR asked me to give this to you. Ethan stared at the box, his mind racing. "What is this?" he demanded, his tone sharp but shaky. The clerk avoided his eyes as she replied, "Your personal belongings." She placed the box on a nearby table and stepped back quickly, as if afraid of lingering too long. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened the box. Inside were framed photos of his family, a few pens, and a coffee mug with the bank's logo. He pulled out the mug and stared at it for a moment before setting it down with a loud thud. The whispers in the bullpen grew louder as employees exchanged glances and murmured behind their screens. Ethan turned toward them sharply, but no one met his gaze. He picked up the box and walked out of the office slowly, clutching it tightly against his chest. His footsteps echoed down the hallway as he passed desks filled with people who once respected him, but now barely acknowledged his existence. The camera lingered on Ethan's retreating figure as he exited the building, his shoulders slumped under the weight of silent judgment. Ethan Caldwell sat in his car, staring at his phone as it buzzed repeatedly with incoming calls. The screen lit up with familiar names, old colleagues, former clients, but each time he answered, the line went dead. He tried again, dialing the number of a senior executive he had once mentored. The call rang twice before going to voicemail. Ethan left a message, his voice strained but measured. "Hey, it's Ethan. Just wanted to touch base about, well, everything. Call me back when you can." The silence that followed was deafening. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked into a coffee shop near the bank, hoping to find someone willing to talk. He spotted a former mentee seated by the window, typing on her laptop. A flicker of relief crossed his face as he approached her table. "Claire," he said softly, forcing a smile. She looked up briefly but didn't return the smile. Her expression was guarded as she closed her laptop and stood abruptly. "I have to go," she said quickly, avoiding his gaze as she gathered her things and walked out the door without another word. Ethan stood frozen in place, watching her retreating figure through the glass window. His chest tightened as he realized she hadn't even given him a chance to explain. The next day, Ethan tried texting another colleague, a man he had worked alongside for years. The response came hours later. "I think it's best we keep our distance right now." At a networking event later that week, Ethan approached a group of professionals he had once considered friends. They exchanged polite nods but turned away quickly, their conversations resuming without him. As Ethan walked home that evening, his world felt smaller than ever before. The people who had once surrounded him were now stepping away, quietly but decisively, leaving him alone with nothing but the weight of his own actions. Ethan Caldwell sat at his dining table, his laptop open in front of him. The screen glowed faintly in the dim room, illuminating his tired, unshaven face. He scrolled through his email inbox, hoping for something, anything, that would signal a lifeline. His eyes landed on a new message with the subject line, "Account termination request." His heart sank as he clicked it open. "Dear Mr. Caldwell, due to recent events, I regret to inform you that I will be withdrawing all my accounts and investments from Monarch Financial. This decision is final. Sincerely, James Whitaker." Ethan leaned back in his chair, the words blurring as he stared at the screen. James Whitaker wasn't just any client. He was one of Ethan's wealthiest and most loyal accounts. They had shared drinks at exclusive clubs, exchanged holiday cards, even attended each other's family events. He picked up his phone and dialed James's number, desperation creeping into his voice as he left a voicemail. "James, it's Ethan. I saw your email. Look, I know things have been complicated lately, but we've worked together for years. Can we talk?" The call ended with a beep, and Ethan set the phone down slowly, his hand trembling. He glanced at the laptop again, where his reflection stared back at him in the darkened screen, a distorted version of himself that he barely recognized. The screen flickered as another email came in. Termination of business relationship. Ethan closed the laptop abruptly and stood up, pacing the room as frustration bubbled to the surface. He stopped in front of a mirror hanging on the wall and stared at his reflection. His once confident posture was gone, replaced by slumped shoulders and hollow eyes. He pressed his hands against the edges of the mirror as if trying to steady himself, but the image staring back offered no comfort, only a reminder of what he had lost.